couple of years ago, when I was in between jobs, I moved into an apartment to save money. The apartment complex was beautiful. It was a smaller complex located right in the heart of a quiet and nestled community. Most of the residents in the complex were older folks that were retired and just didn't need the space of an entire house. When I was moving into the building, I noticed another young person like me watching from one of the windows. It was a beautiful girl, someone that personally I would consider to be out of my league. Unfortunately, my career didn't allow for much dating. After moving in, I noticed that often I would come or go from the parking lot and I would see the woman looking at me. I just assumed that she was nosy or something like that, and I didn't think for 1 second that she had any interest in me. Down the road from the complex was a grocery store that was very convenient to stop in on my way home from work. One afternoon after work, when I stopped in the store to grab some dinner, I ended up physically running into the girl who had been staring at me for a few days now, and I literally mean that we physically collided with each other. I was turning into an aisle with my head on my phone, and she was walking out of the aisle. In a nervous voice, she said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm just an idiot sometimes." I started to say it was okay, but stopped when I realized who it was. Once everything clicked, I said, "Hey, are you the girl that lives in my building?" She started to smile and blush, and then said, "Yeah, that's me." I'm usually the one who gets nervous and blushes uncontrollably in these kinds of situations, so it was nice that the heat was on someone else for a change. She made some comments about her stupid cheeks turning red, and I responded by telling her that in high school, my friends used to call me a cherry pie because my face was always red. We both laughed as I diffused the tension. We made small talk for a little while right there in the store, and then that evolved into a real conversation. Finally, I worked up the courage to ask if she wanted to come over for dinner tonight since we were practically neighbors. She smiled and looked thrilled by the offer. She accepted and said that she would be over at around 7, and we exchanged numbers and went about our shopping. I was so excited and nervous about my date with this very attractive neighbor that I had. I realized that I only had about an hour to clean my apartment and get ready. I hadn't had a real date since my freshman year of college, over 4 years ago, so I was admittedly a train wreck in my mind. I even remember while I was cleaning the apartment, I got a text from her that said, "I can't wait for tonight," with a heart. Before I knew it, it was 7, and she was knocking on my door. The first several hours were amazing. We talked, ate dinner, had some wine, and just had a great evening. I felt like this was my first real adult date, and I was proud of how it was unfolding. Late in the evening, I was ready for bed. And this was a weeknight, and I had to work the next day, and I could tell that she wanted to stay, but I made it clear that I wasn't ready for anything further than this. She was understanding, and we said goodnight at around 11 p.m. When I walked her to her door, which sat about 30 feet from my door, I kissed her goodnight, and she smiled. I walked inside my apartment with an overwhelming feeling of joy and happiness. I woke up at around 3 a.m. that morning just to use the bathroom, and I noticed something weird as I walked into the hall. In the light that was shining under the door to my apartment was a shadow, like someone was standing in front of my door. I figured it was my tired eyes just playing tricks on me, so I didn't worry too much. After the bathroom, when I walked by the door again, I noticed that the obstruction to the light was still there. I quietly went over to the door and looked through the peephole in the door, and standing right outside my door was the girl that I had just shared an entire evening with. She looked like she was mumbling something under her breath, but I wasn't sure. If I ever look through one of those holes, they're not very clear sometimes, so I watched for a few seconds and she didn't move at all. I snuck back into my room and grabbed my phone. I made sure that it was silent and went back to the door, and I texted her phone and said, "Hey, I can't sleep, but I just wanted to let you know that I had a great time tonight." Seconds later, she grabbed her phone from her pocket, and with no expression on her face, she responded with, "Me too," with an exclamation point. "I can't wait to see you again." I waited for a moment, and then sent another text that said, "I'm surprised you're awake, what are you up to?" Her response turned the butterflies in my stomach to stone when she responded with, "Oh, just laying in bed, watching Netflix." I couldn't understand why she was standing there and lying about it. I didn't respond to her text right away. I had no idea what to say to this woman or how to approach a situation like this. While I was thinking of something to say, she texted me again, this time saying, "If you want, I can come back. or you can come here." The text was followed by a bunch of emojis. I started to type a response but kept deleting whatever I typed. While I was typing, she texted me again and said, "You have nothing to be afraid of." And that text hit me differently for some reason. I finally sent a simple text that just read, "Thanks for the offer, but I'm really tired." I looked through the hole as she read the message, and still, with no expression on her face, she put the phone back in her pocket and looked right at the peephole. I knew she couldn't see me, but the horror that I felt when I sort of made eye contact with the woman through the door was almost indescribable. The look on her face was not the same look I had just admired that evening prior. Her eyes looked cold, and I have no idea what her intentions were, but I just felt like they weren't good. I know I'm not good at dating, but I do know standing outside someone's door in the middle of the night motionless is not normal behavior. I decided to text her one last time and said, "Hey, did you hear anything funny in the hall? I thought I heard a knock on my door." This was my poor attempt to try and fish something out of her, or at least elicit some reaction. She looked at the text for a minute, then back at the peephole with her cold eyes as if though she knew I was there. And without moving from her position, she texted me one last time that said, "You're a smart boy. Very smart. Sleep tight." She put her head back down, and after about 5 minutes of just standing there, she turned around and went back to her apartment. She looked like she had something tucked in the back of her pants, but looking through the peephole, this could have just been my imagination, so I wasn't sure. I texted her the next day and she never responded. Even though she lived a few doors down, I never did run into her again. I left a note for her one time and slipped it under her door and still never heard from her. I never told the apartment management because I didn't really think anything could be done. It was an unnerving and terrifying experience for me, but I had no proof other than a few text messages that didn't show anything legal or really make any sense. I never saw her again, which is insane considering that I lived at this apartment for 6 months after this experience. The curtains were always shut when I would get home from work, and I never crossed paths with her in the hallway. Now, I know the story isn't your typical, "oh god, I'm gonna die" story, but to put yourself in my shoes, I guarantee you wouldn't want to be me. The memory of that look in her eyes still haunts me to this day. Friends have always joked with me that she probably was just looking for some adult companionship, but I promise you this was different. Be careful out there because you never know what kind of intentions people have deep down.
My name is Corey, and I'm 24 years old. A few months ago, my father decided to sell the old house that he inherited from an old uncle. So I offered to check out the house in order to make an inventory of everything, furniture and other objects. I had to note what needed to be remodeled before the sale could take place. My brother Chad agreed to go with me. We were going to spend a weekend in that house in order to do so. The house was huge. It didn't have an attic, but it did have a basement, and the ground floor and bedroom floor were enormous. "I think Dad is going to make some decent money out of this house," Chad said. "Yeah, but he's probably going to spend a few bucks regarding restoration, not to mention hiring people to clean it up," I replied, as we were walking around, exploring the mansion. "Wow, and pest control too? Look, a rat just passed me by." "I hate rats," Chad pointed out. "Who doesn't? I'm not surprised, but still, I think it will be a decent investment," I said. That first day, we made a list of all the relevant items that we found that could also be sold, including some silver items and a golden statue, and some well-carved wooden chairs, which were probably valuable as well. There was no TV, not even an internet connection, but we still had a good time. Yes, we went prepared for our time there. "It's 2 a.m., bro. I'm off to bed," I said to Chad. We already had decided which room each of us would sleep in. "I hear that. I'll do the same. Don't forget to close your door so the rats won't barge in," Chad said. He was really afraid of those nasty rodents. I laughed and said goodnight. When it was about 4 a.m., I woke up. I was feeling thirsty. It always happens when I drink beer. I decided to go to the kitchen, but I could hear a faint noise coming from the kitchen. At first, I thought it was my brother, but the lights were off. Oh, great. Rats. Awesome. I said to myself before entering the kitchen. As I turned the lights on, I saw a huge human figure eating the leftovers of our meals. "Hey, who are you?" I shouted. The human figure looked at me, and I was terrified to see his big, dark eyes and huge mouth. A mouth that wasn't human. It rather resembled a canine structure, just like the rest of his head. The creature appeared to be a mix between a dog and a man. I screamed, and the werewolf, so to speak, pushed me with an enormous strength. I fell to the ground. The creature jumped on me. The werewolf was now looking at me with its huge, bulky dark eyes. His mouth was open and dripping smelly, disgusting saliva on my head. I thought he was going to bite my head off, as I understood he was studying me and probably trying to decide if I was a source of food. Fortunately, before doing so, my brother Chad shouted as he was coming over to the kitchen. "Corey, what's that noise? Are you all right?" Hearing my brother's voice, the creature simply ran with incredible speed, precisely like a dog running with its 4 legs. "Wow! What the hell? Help!" my brother Chad screamed as I heard him falling down the stairs. I got up and went to my brother. Did you see that? Are you hurt?" I asked him. "Yeah, I saw that. What in the name of all gods was that? A giant wolf?" "No, I'm not hurt. Fortunately, the floor and stairs are covered by carpet," he answered. "Where did that thing go? Upstairs?" "Yes. Let's call the police," Chad said. I agreed. We did call the authorities. I had enough presence of mind to say that we were dealing with a wolf, so they wouldn't think I was just a dumb young man. "Okay, we're sending a car right now," they said. Meanwhile, Chad and I were now more curious than frightened due to the adrenaline rush, and of course we had each other's back. On top of it, we knew that the cops would be here soon. We decided to search for the werewolf or whatever the beast was. "We should probably carry some sharp knives from the kitchen," I said. "I hear you, bro," Chad replied. After doing so, we headed upstairs while making as little noise as humanly possible. Our bedrooms were quiet, but we were able to hear something inside the walls. The noise led us to another room where we saw a big hole in the corner of the wall. "The creature is living inside the walls. It uses this hole to get in and to come out," Chad said. "Yeah, I can see that. And now what? Do we go inside?" I asked. But even before I could answer, a big, hairy arm came out of the hole and started to grab my brother Chad. "Help, Corey!" my brother shouted. I started to stab the werewolf's arm, but it only made things worse for my brother. Much worse. Horrified, I heard and saw my brother's neck snap right in front of me. In just a couple of seconds, he was dead. The creature, perhaps understanding that its victim was dead, went back to its hole. The next couple of hours passed by in a rush. The cops came and shot the beast. I saw its dark eyes, under the policeman's flashlights, slowly closing, and hear its desperate and hopeless final growling. It was dead, just like my brother. Within a couple of hours, a team of enigmatic individuals dressed in white lab coats, escorted by some armed men in black, took the creature's corpse with them in a dark, unmarked, closed van. The case was reported as a wolf attack, and to this day, such is the official version of what killed my brother Chad, even though there was no way a wolf could have grabbed someone's throat, snapping it. Chad's death broke my father. He never believed my story, and instead blamed me for being a careless brother.
The story I'm about to share is strange, mysterious, and still open-ended. This story may keep you up at night, but not for the usual reasons. Instead, if you're like me, you'll think about it all night long. Let me start by saying that moving is a strange blend of excitement and dread. It's often exciting moving to a new place and making it your home, but the flip side of that is the act of moving, and that can just be dreadful. I have moved at least a dozen times in my life, and I'm only 31 years old. 2 years ago, after breaking up with my longtime girlfriend, I needed a place to stay. Her and I bought a house together, but after the breakup, I moved out, so I lived in an apartment for a year. When that year's lease was up, I looked for a house instead of renting another apartment. I didn't want to buy another house just yet for several reasons, specifically because I was finishing up my degree and I may move out of state after graduation, and the fact that the housing market a year ago was still a mess, much like it is now. I ended up finding an old but mostly refurbished house through a coworker. She introduced me to a neighbor of hers who was looking to rent a house that he purchased for cheap. This guy was one of those guys that just bought houses and rented them out. So the guy never lived there or anything like that, just bought it, slightly refurbished it, and then rented it out. And I just happened to be looking at the right time and scooped the place up. To keep everyone's information private who was involved in this story, I'll be using fake names. And with that being said, I'm going to call my landlord in this story Joe. What I really liked about the situation, other than the fact it was a whole house and not an apartment, was that Joe was willing to do a month-to-month lease. Sometimes that can be messy, but it worked for my lifestyle at the time. Joe and I signed all the papers, agreed on the price, and I became the proud renter of a home on the corner of a very secluded street. Once I moved in, I ended up falling in love with the house. It was huge, way bigger than I initially thought when I had just looked at the pictures. You could tell the house was old, but everything inside was updated and new. Joe even had the Wi-Fi set up and was included in my rent payment. As I had just stated, the house sat on the corner of a street that was off another 3 side streets. You would have to turn off the main road, which wasn't that busy of a road to begin with, and then go down several more streets until you hit the street that I was on. At the very end of the street sat my newly rented house, which was concealed behind a massive cluster of trees. I figured, being an online student and working from home a lot, this privacy was super ideal. The first month was great. I never saw any of my neighbors, which was great for me. It was quiet, and I mostly just spent the time moving in and getting myself set up. When you move into a new place, it takes a little while to make you feel like it's an actual home, but for some reason, I just didn't feel at home in this new place. I loved the seclusion of the house and all the perks, but I just had a feeling something wasn't quite right. I had a small get-together at the start of the second month in the house. I was giving a tour of the place to some friends, and we made our way to the basement. While down there, we could hear this strange noise, almost like something scratching or something coming from one of the walls near the stairs. I really hadn't been in the basement at all since I moved in. It's possible that noise had always been there, but I just never go down there because the washer and dryer are in a separate room off the kitchen, so this was really the first time I had heard that noise. One of my friends joked that it was rats. Another friend joked that I must have someone tied up in the walls, and my one friend was really scared and just wanted to leave the basement. We all had a laugh and went upstairs to continue the friends' gathering. However, I couldn't stop thinking of the noise the entire night. This noise was not just plumbing or pipes. It was definitely a scratching noise, no doubt about it. Eventually, everyone left except my friend Mike. We had a couple of beers and decided that we were going to figure out what that noise was in the basement. We went down there with crowbars and hammers like we knew what we were doing, but full disclosure, we had no clue. We listened for the noise and tracked it to the same location that we had heard it earlier. It sounded like scratching coming from behind the stairs. I must admit, I was pretty nervous. My mind was racing trying to figure out what the noise could be, but the adrenaline from the situation had me pumped up. Mike and I can thank the beers for what happened next. We thought it would be a lovely idea to take the hammer and smash the wall beneath the stairs, and smash away we did. I am still, a year later, in utter shock at what we found underneath the stairs. I shined a flashlight into the dark hole, and we quickly found the source of the scratches. I counted at least 12 big rats. I'm sure there were more, but after 12 I was done counting. The rats were the least of our concern. In this dark cavern underneath the stairs was a ton of these dark grayish-red stains everywhere. The small room was no bigger than a broom closet. There were also chains, shackles, knives, and I kid you not, a scythe. The chains and the rest of the items down there were extremely rusted, so I gathered that they must have been very old. The creepiest part for me, for some reason, though, was a small dirty bowl in the corner of the room that had a rusted fork in it, and a stack of old books. I don't know what the books were. They were those old books that have that almost fabric feel to them. I'm sorry, I don't know what the material is called, and the pages looked almost yellow. One of the books was opened and the writing was almost completely faded. I called Joe right away, not even caring that it was around midnight at this point. Joe came right over and looked at the hole for himself. He seemed to be in a combination of confused, mad, and embarrassed. And I moved out after that night and went to my parents' house, and Joe didn't give me any trouble about doing so given the situation. He even refunded my first month rent. I often think about that little room under the stairs. I still don't know what it is or what ended up happening. I've thought about reaching out to Joe to see what he did about the situation, but I thought that may be a little strange. I guess one reason why I'm writing this is to see what people think I should do. Is there a way to look up past owners of a house? I really don't know a lot about being an internet sleuth, so any advice out there would be greatly appreciated. If I ever find out what happened in that room, I'll write a follow-up, but until then, I'm left with the mystery of the dark, scary room underneath the stairs.
For a very short period of my life, during the awfully long, brutal, and cold winter I turned 18, I lived in a fairly small house in Vermont. My family didn't live there long. It was located in the forest. It was way too quiet and serene, although the air felt fresher and generally calmer. Too calm, and far from almost everything, making any task that required leaving the house pretty inconvenient and requiring extensive planning. There was one experience I had at that house during the time I lived there. I would likely never forget it. And I want to share it with you, my friends. It was January. I only remember that because I can recall New Year's Day being just a few days earlier. My cousin Jason and I were both still on school break at the time and had planned to spend the night at my place. This was something we would often do. We would typically stay up till 2 or 3 a.m. playing Xbox, watching movies, or something along those lines. And this would all happen in the living room. On that evil night, we'd been watching a movie. I don't remember the name of the movie. That's the only detail I can't remember. What I do remember is that halfway through the movie, Jason kept looking out of the window just slightly to the right of where we were sat. It got to the point where every minute I could see his head move out of the corner of my eye. Also, that night there was a fairly bad snowstorm happening. Now, at first I thought he'd been watching the snowfall, until I realized just how long he'd been staring out the window. "What are you looking at, Jason?" I asked him, wishing the lights were on. We switched it off because, why not? "I thought I saw something outside. Wanted to be sure," Jason responded. He still kept on staring out of the window. That instantly filled me with anxiety, because where we lived, wild animals weren't all that common. And like I mentioned earlier, we didn't really live near anything. So someone on our property, especially at that hour and during a snowstorm, would definitely cause concern. But I shrugged it off. It probably was nothing, I told my mind. Or it was just the storm playing with Jason's mind. Nothing happened for a couple of minutes, but he still couldn't stop staring. And now it was beginning to creep me out. "Can you stop looking outside now? Have you seen anything?" I queried. "Be quiet. There's something out there, Ben." Jason finished speaking and I looked out. Just then, we saw it. Yes, you heard me right. We saw it. The clear shadow of a person moving from one tree to the next. Both of us sprang up in reaction. There was no sound, but the sheer sight alone was enough to startle us. This was approximately 200 feet away from the house, so we couldn't exactly tell if the person was coming closer or not. We both looked at each other and right back out the window to confirm we were both seeing what we saw. A couple of minutes went by before it happened again, but this time it was much further to the left of where the first sighting had occurred. I cleaned the sweat off my brows, and that was when I noticed Jason's breathing. He was wheezing, and I quickly tossed my inhaler to him. I thought about calling my dad, but for some reason I wanted to hold out for a bit and try and figure things out on my own. By this time, the storm had intensified and the wind was more violent. The pattern of the moving shadows became more frequent and evident. It was clear to us that there was more than just one person, as multiple figures were now moving and ducking from one tree to the other. One of the figures got out from behind a tree, but this time, instead of moving behind another one, it just stood there. He careened towards us, towards the window, and on instinct, we turned to take cover. We paused, and were shocked when nothing happened. I got my heart to start working again, and summoned the courage to look out of the window. The figure stood there, covered in animal skin and with bloodshot eyes and a face painted in black. I stared into his eyes, and at that moment I wondered how he stood still under the storm without shivering, undisturbed by it. He just stared right back at me. He muttered something, but I couldn't make out what he meant. I could only tell he was speaking because his mouth was moving. Then he took a step forward. I moved back, and he walked towards the window. He raised his bloodied hand and wrote on the window, "Kill." And then suddenly, without warning, he hit the glass with his fist. When he did so the third time, he made a crack in the window, and that was when the fight or flight kicked in. It was enough to break us out of our sort of trance of disbelief we were in, and I ran straight upstairs to wake up my dad. "Dad, you have to come with me now!" "What? What's going on?" My dad spoke quickly, worried. He picked up his glasses, and I explained to him as clearly as I could. By the time he got up and followed me downstairs, there was no one outside. Jason and I both explained to him what we had seen. Now, typically, I don't think my dad would have believed us, but I guess he was able to see the genuine panic in our eyes. We all went around the house verifying all the doors and windows were locked. My dad then went outside, armed with a weapon. He briefly walked around the house before returning inside. He had found nothing. That night, we convinced my dad to sleep in the living room with us because we were terrified. By the morning, the snowstorm had stopped completely. We went outside to better assess the situation in the daylight, and we weren't surprised to find multiple sets of footprints in the snow next to the trees facing our living room window. They were pretty filled in from the snowstorm, but still clearly visible and recognizable. There were even some around the house, like on top of the footprints my dad had made the night before. I talked to my dad about it, and he said those had not been there when he went outside. The more disturbing thing was that our shed was completely open. The only thing missing was the knives we used for hunting. None of this, however, was evidence for my dad to call the cops. We moved out of that house 2 weeks later. To be honest, that particular incident was not the sole reason for our movement. It was what I told you at the start. We never planned to stay in that house for a long period. I was extremely grateful for this. As far as I remember, nothing happened in those 2 weeks, but both me and my cousin had a hard time getting some sleep. When I think about it, the whole experience still freaks me out to this day. I mean, to see unknown, scary people on your isolated property in the middle of the night and during a snowstorm? It's what nightmares are made of.